What is going on, golf fans? It's your boy Gsluke here with our live stream for the Mexico Open. We're going to go over any of those last second questions that you have, as well as a weather report, some ownership out there before DFS lock, as well as some prize picks and underdog exposure that I've already gone to. You might want to consider adding to a few slips of your own. But wherever you're at, hopefully you guys are having a fantastic Wednesday and are ready for all the action this week. So any of those questions, any player deep dives that you're hoping for, go ahead, let me know down there in the live chat, and I'll make sure to give you all that last second info that you're looking for. What's going on, Griffin? You've got a last minute flyer that you'd love to run by me. Go ahead and fire, dude. That's what this live stream is for, and always willing to go through some deep dives. But before we go through any specific players, some of the strategy heading into DFS lock, do want to mention what we have with this golf course, which I already have a full course breakdown up and all that, but this is truly a long hitter bombers golf course and a track where you've got to have your long irons in check. So not any of that has really changed out there from Monday. The golf course conditions are pretty much spot in line with what we were expecting. And when we take a look at the weather out there for Thursday and Friday, it looks very consistent out there from round to round. So on Thursday, you can see the winds aren't that much of a factor in the morning, a little bit more so from about noon onwards. It goes from about sub 4 miles an hour in the morning, closer to that 5 to 8 miles an hour sustained in the afternoon. And then on Friday, this is the ECM model that I currently have up. It's that same story. Morning, sub 4 mile an hour winds. Afternoon, just a little bit more substantial. So if we go through a few of the other ones on here, so this is the GFS model. I would say Thursday, it ramps up a little bit as the day goes on, the wind that is. And then over here on Friday, it is much of the same. So, you go through Icon, you could do the same kind of process there. Same thing out there with Medio Blue. They all pretty much look the same. So I wouldn't expect there to be a massive edge over there in main slate when it comes to playing the AM versus the PM wave, because on one day, right, when you have those AM wave conditions that are calmer, you're going to have the PM wave conditions the next day and vice versa. So it's all probably going to end up evening out when it all is said and done. Now, the weather forecast could flip on its head on Friday, right? We've seen some crazier stuff happen. So if you're 150 maxing, you might want to think about stacking one way versus the other. Out there 5, maybe 10% of your lineups, that sort of thing, but it's not anything that you'd go remotely all in on. It's not even like 20-25% of your lineups, because it doesn't look like there's much of an edge to be had at all. So it's worth noting that historically, from the showdown perspective, at the morning wave guys had a significant advantage around here, and a lot of that comes down to the wind kind of ramping up, as you can see on all these models, but also the receptiveness of the greens, which it is also worth noting that in some of the player interviews that I've seen so far, they did mention that there are some bounce to the greens this year, which last year they were pretty receptive. A year before that, the same thing, but the wind gusts were a lot more significant than what you have these first few days. So I think it might be a little bit firmer out here in 2025. The winds, the calm conditions, the first few rounds are going to lead to some pretty good scoring. So in terms of the averages that you had over 2024, 2023, etc., I don't think any of that's going to change all that much. So that's why we don't have to adjust all that much since what we went over on Monday. The one thing to consider in Showdown, go after some of those earlier starters. With the low winds over the first few days and the more receptive conditions, I could see it playing half a shot easier out there in each case. But like I said, that's going to even out when it's all said and done. Let me bring up my spreadsheet. We'll talk about the strategy out there for this week, which will include ownership out there from 8K plus. So just like we've done in all the live streams this year, we're going to focus on that portion of the board. So of course, for all my projections, you can find those over there on my Patreon page for everyone that is 8K and below. But for the purposes of this live stream, that's where a lot of our game theory talk is going to come in. But feel free to go ahead, ask me on any specific players, and let's go ahead and get this thing rolling. What's going on, Branson? Como estás, Lucas? Muy bien, ¿y tú? I took plenty of Spanish living down here in Florida, but I love it. You're already getting me in the mood. What's going on, Tyler? What's up? Great plays last Sunday. Keep it up. I appreciate that, man. We'll keep it rolling. Stats look appetizing on these holes. You're high on Kisner. Yeah, I'm playing some Kisner this week as well, Griffin. So I think we're in lockstep there. High birdie percentage player, plays well at resort-style golf courses. There's something there out there with Kiz. So I'll be right there with you. What's going on, Steven? Welcome on in. Says good evening and all. Let's get it. And of course, you said thank you. Let's go ahead and get after this. And vamos, as Brant would say. So strategy towards the top end of the board. So you can see the ownership out there, 8K plus, and a lot of it is coming on these 10K players. part of it is just spending all of your salary and people's inability to go out there and leave salary on the table. So regardless of how good a play Akshay is, he was going to always be 25% plus. But you can see here, I have him at nearly 33% ownership. So you're talking about easily the highest owned player on the slate. And I would argue that no one on this entire board here should be 15% plus. Like, I know Kurt Kitayama's 24%, Erasmus is up there at 23%. It'd be hard to go out there and fade all three of these players up top. But I think there's a really good argument for fading anyone that has ownership towards the top end of the board. And now down this 8-9K range, there's no one that's outrageous chalk. Like a Steven Yeager, I've got it like nearly 17%. I've got Taylor Moore at about 16%, like maybe Knapp at 15% ownership, as a little bit more steam than some of the other players around him. But your main pieces of egregious chalk this week are these top 3 10K guys. And like I said, a lot of that just comes down to the pricing. This 9K range, right, you've got a lot more options to choose from. 8K range is pretty large and healthy on a week like this. And quite a few people that I think are good plays down there in the 8K range. So that helps kind of spread out that ownership. But the 10K range, we've only got 3 players, and now that's why it's all going to congregate on those options. So I'll tell you personally, I'm not going to tell you who I'm playing out of those top 3, but I'm fading 2 of those top 3 high-owned players. So you don't have to take that approach. If you choose to take some of that ownership towards the top, it is going to likely force you down to the 6K range, because when you're taking a 10K plus player in a lineup, especially if you want to pair that up with an 8-9K player, maybe even a second one over there in the 8-9K range, it's going to force you down to that 6K range for salary relief. So, if you're doing so, it's likely going to give you a chance to offset some of that chalk that you're playing, but keep that in mind when you're going through your builds. You're talking about double, sometimes even triple the ownership of some of the guys a little bit further down the board. And I would say in single entries, especially your higher dollar single entries, where people get a little bit tighter with their portfolio, right? They don't like to play very bold out there in those high dollar single entries. Now, these players are going to be even higher owned than what you have in those large field GPPs. Now, down here, the 8-9K range, just because I said ownership was spread out doesn't mean that you have to ignore it, but it's not a big deal when you don't have anyone that's like double the ownership of everyone else around him. So I already pointed out some of those guys that were getting steam, right? Namely a Yeager, Taylor Moore, maybe a Jake Knapp that we threw out there as well. But outside of those 3 players that if you use, you maybe have to offset with a lower end guy towards the bottom, everyone else is fair game here on that 8 and 9K range. So I would say that there's a good amount of sleeper plays that you could get to here. Now, I've got to keep some of those behind the paywall because I don't want to steam them up over here on the live stream. But, I'll give you guys one. Dumpy Bo, I'm not that worried if a bunch of people go out there and play him. He is the lowest owned player that I have of anyone in the 9K range. But, like, Dumpy Bo's the same as all these other guys here. Like, they all kind of suck. They're all slapdick players. That's the kind of field that we have here for the Mexico Open. And you want to embrace that. And when you have guys that are maybe double the ownership, like I know I have Yeager here at about 17%. Maybe a better comparison would be Taylor Moore because he's only $100 cheaper. There's a chance that in your higher dollar stuff where people are playing a little tighter, as I mentioned before, that Taylor Moore could be double the ownership of Bo Hostler and those kind of builds. And they're essentially the same guy. In terms of their win equity, they're both at that same kind of number. I know that Taylor Moore does have that tour win and Bo Hostler doesn't, but Hostler also has a lot more top 5 finishes than what you have there with Taylor Moore. So, I'd rather take the low-owned player when you're choosing between those two kinds of players. And I know the form, right, might be a little bit better on a Taylor Moore, but you're talking about 0.55 shots gained per round as opposed to 0.37 shots gained per round, which sure, that's great to have in your back pocket, right? It's number 21 as opposed to number 30 in the field when it comes to recent form ranking, but that shouldn't dictate double the ownership out there in those large field contests. So this is game theory, right? This is why we're looking for pivots out there in our exposure, but especially on a week like this, you want to be considering this because we're not talking about Scotty Scheffler at the top. That's 33% owned. It's Akshay Bhatia, and Akshay Bhatia misses cuts every once in a while. Now, he is very consistent at this stage of his career. He is the best player in the field. I don't want to dispute that, but he's not Scotty Scheffler. That's 30-40% owned. Down here, the 9K range, it's not Patrick Cantlay. It's not Colin Morikawa, for example, right? That's like 18 to 20% owned. It's guys like Steven Yeager and a Taylor Moore down here at $9,000 that you're taking at that same kind of steam. Like you need to have that perspective in the back of your mind. Any chalk this week, in my opinion, is almost immediately disgusting chalk, which is going to keep me off of a lot of those higher owned players. So, if there was somebody on Monday that I was really high on, like a Harry Hall, you guys can see that he's a core play for me. I bet him there at 33-1. I'm not going to jump ship on those sort of players. So, for example, a Muller, same thing with a Nikolai Højgaard down here, $8,100. It's not like they're low owned. I mean, 13%, nearly 14% down there on their Nico is significantly higher owned than some of the other guys around him. But if they weren't guys that I was betting outright, I really wanted to add to my portfolio as soon as I started breaking down this event, they're probably not making my player pool that sort of ownership. So I think that's at least my strategy when it goes to going out there and making my own 50 max pool. My conviction plays have to be people that I like a lot more and are actually worthy of taking in 30-40% of my lineups, because if you're going to get leverage to a 15 to 20% of the player, you've got to play them in 40% of lineups to get that 2x, right? Might be closer to 35-36% that you have to get that 2x roll, but either way, it's a healthy portion of your 150 max pool. So, you want to be very sold on those kind of players before you use them. And up top at that 10K range, if we use that same 2x rule, Akshay Bhatia, you got to use in like 2/3 of your lineups. Like, that's just crazy to me. Any week, even if he is the best player that you have in that field, a Kurt Kitayama, a Rasmus Højgaard, you've got to play them in at least 40% of lineups, you would think, to go out there and get that 2x leverage. It's just not the kind of week where I'm willing to do that kind of thing. So I am playing one of those 10K players. I already told you I'm not going to tip my hand on who that is, but I'm only using them in 35% of my lineups. In fact, I actually think it was 34% after I got my single entries mixed in there. So I'm not even going 2x leverage on my 10K player, which is pretty blasphemous. I'm almost always going for 2x leverage with a vast majority of my plays out there in DFS. But I refuse. And there is one guy in that 10K range that I actually think is an okay play here. But I also only play him in 35% of my 150 max. So I think it tells you a lot about the ownership up top. Down here in the 8K range, just to show you the bottom end of that ownership there, guys like a Grayson Sig starting to become lower owned. But when you compare this ownership here, like 8-9%, on guys like an Olesen, a CT Pan there at 9.2%, it's not all that different than this top end of the 7K range. So what you guys don't get, obviously, with the censored projections over here is that perspective for the top end of the 7K range, because a lot of times this 8K range will be significantly higher owned than what we have here in the 7s. And it's a pretty big drop off when it comes to the ownership, but it's pretty seamless, actually, from guys like a Ryan Fox, a Sig here at about 8%, to this Wallace Meissner Fishburne range that are pretty much all in that 6 to 8% range themselves. So it's the kind of slate where ownership is really spread out. And that just happens at these lower tier fields. It's not like a major championship where you might have like a Joaquin Neiman who's way too cheap at one of the majors. You might have like an $8,500 Brooks Koepka, right? And everyone loves playing them out there at major championships that people are all going to go out there and hunker around. Yeah, really, if anything, it's like Jake Knapp, because he won here last year. That's about it up there towards the top end of the board. So it's kind of just play your guys, at least in this section. But as we get further down here to that 6 and 7K range, that's where ownership really becomes valuable. And what you'll see with a few of the plays that we're going to point out here towards the end of it is that they're all going to be super low owned diamonds in the rough. So, guys that maybe aren't being talked up as some of the other guys around the industry. Goddard will be one. We'll talk about Thurston Lawrence and also Jose Luis Ballester Barrio down here at $6,400 as some diamonds in the rough that you can get to offset some of that other ownership. Let's catch up on chat and some of the questions, though, before we start to do a deep dive of that 6 and 7K ownership. Where did we leave off? So Jay has a question about single entry tips for building. So you're thinking about ownership, course style, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, my single entries, I have a different strategy than a lot of people do. A lot of people in their single entries like to play their core plays, and they like to take more ownership because you don't have to beat as many other people. I totally get that. I take a very aggressive single entry approach. I know that I'm only playing against 300, 400 other people, but and I can't say too much about this because it's an edge I have. It's something that I actively employ every single week out here in DFS. But the higher dollar contest you play, and it has a lot to do with how much you're actually playing for. Not so much the fact that it's a single entry, but if you're playing in anything that's $100 plus, especially when you start getting into $200 plus single entries, people play like pussies, for lack of a better word. They play like they're scared. They do, because they have more on the line. Now, your pros don't fall into that same sort of trap. Your McLovins, Uticaus, all those guys, your big name touts out there aren't falling for that same sort of trick. But your casuals that are maybe stepping up in terms of their stakes level always play the super high owned chalk in those single entry contests. So what I do, Jay, is I eliminate those chalky players, the guys that I know for a fact are going to get all the extra ownership, and I just go down to the step below. So I'm not playing my optimal a lot of times because, as we just talked about, I like Højgaard this week. I like some guys that are getting some ownership, like Potgeider, for example, down there in that 7K range. I won't use them in my single entry, even though they are my core plays, because they're getting the extra ownership and they're the safe plays that a lot of people are going to get to. So my best advice, Jay, is you still want to build one of your better lineups. You want to have guys that you're comfortable with, but don't be so comfortable that you're taking and holding hands with everyone else out there, because that's the biggest mistake that you could possibly make when it comes to your game theory and your strategy. Thoughts on Smalley? Really good form heading in, Nick. I fear that he's getting some steam, though. So if you go up here to the recent form tab, I'll show you guys what we have here with Smalley. He's the number 2 player in the entire field when it comes to recent form ranking. Number 1 would be a Jackson Suber, by the way, because his shots gained rounds have just been ridiculous out there in the PGA Tour. Now, a lot of those events where he has the shots gained metrics that look good were at multiple course setups, right? So the other courses, the other rounds without the shots gained metrics were terrible for Jackson Suber. So realistically, your number 1 actual form player is Alex Smalley here, even though he is ranked number 2. So that's what I can say positive about him. The unfortunate aspect is I have him here at about 13% ownership. I think in those single entries, those contests that we were just talking about, where we had the single entry question, Smalley might be 15 to 20% owned because he has that form. People love going to the hot guy recently out there as a quote unquote safe play. But in this kind of field, an $8,700 Smalley, I mean, it makes me throw up in my mouth when I think about it, is going to get some ownership as well. So full transparency, I'll say I'm playing them out there in my 150 max, but in single entries, some of that higher dollar stuff where people tend to play a little bit tighter, that's where I worry about guys like a Smalley or really anyone that has that good recent form. Of course, Griffin, Luddy, great calls last week. Of course, Ryan, that was a nice outright to go out there and hit number 2 of the year. You had 3 squads in the top 300 in the 200K. And by the way, that's great. Good stuff out there, Ryan. And any thoughts on Molinax? He's got the power that you're looking for in super low ownership. That's really where all the positive ends, because he hasn't been playing all that well recently. But from the course fit angle, he has the kind of skill set off the tee that we're looking for, and could get you a little bit different to the field. And I guess my cat's making a little bit of a cameo over there. My apologies if she's making some noise. What do you think about Kitayama? So he's one of those really chalky guys towards the top, Daniel, that I like the course history. He did have that second place finish when he played here a few years ago, but he's 10-2. That's very expensive for Kitayama, and he's nearly 25% owned, which both would be red flags for me. What's up, Luke? Came in 24th in the big GPP last week. That's a heck of a finish. A lot better than I did, Noah. And I still made money last week at my 150 max. So that's a heck of a finish for you. Who is my favorite of the Mexican golfers? Oof. I don't have one that really I like a whole lot, Noah, but Alvaro Ortiz would probably be my favorite. That is the brother of Carlos Ortiz, who plays on the Live Tour. Alvaro has played well at this track already out there in the past, so that's where I would go. By the way, guys, if you haven't already smashed that like button, go ahead and do so, and also subscribe so don't miss any of the content throughout the weekend, which will also include showdown content and prop content throughout the weekend. Is there any good data on Safa? It's paid content. It's all good. Just curious what you can find on them. So I don't have much information on them. You can take a look at any of those databases out there for the small sample size that you have, but I don't have any opinion on them really whatsoever. Jeremy says, appreciate your content, Luke. Can I get a deep dive on Molinax? Yeah, so we kind of just went through it. I know we had the question about him. Who was it? I forget who asked about him. We had a question about him before, Jeremy. The course fit makes sense. But what I worry about is I'll show you the form, right? We can bring up some of the shots gained metrics. That's why we're here on the live stream. We go to the last 24 rounds for a Trey Molinax. Gaining off the tee, that's where the course fit lies, as we were mentioning, but losing on approach, that's a tough scene. The short game has actually been a positive for him. And if we zoom in a little bit, I'm curious to see what this looks like over the last 12 measured rounds. So still gaining off the tee, and then the putter's been really hot over the last few events. I've got to say, that's not something that we always see from a Trey Mullinax. And while that might be a red flag in some scenarios, I mean, this is a super low owned GPP flyer. I mean, he's $7,100. I don't have his ownership off the top of my head, but I have to imagine that I've got him sub 5% over there in GPPs. I'm not against the play because he does fit the kind of mold that I'm looking for in players. But I will admit that the approach form, it's about neutral lately, so it hasn't been horrendous over his last 12 measured rounds. That's where I'm worried where it comes apart a little bit, because this golf course, for as much as people mention that's a resort style course, you've got some really hard approach shots into these greens, and if you're a little offline, it can go sideways quickly. Last man in the mid sevens, and you're feeling Sam Ryder. Any love there this week? I will admit, Steven, that the off the tee play does scare me with the Sam Ryder. Personally, that was enough to keep me off of him out there in my exposure, but he's a high birdie percentage player. And when you break down his proximity buckets, he's good from 175 plus. At least he was last year when I was doing the last deep dive on his proximity buckets. No idea what it looks like recently. I'd have to do the deep dive on that. But what I'll say about Ryder is if you're playing him, you know he's low owned, because the predominant narrative out there, it's not just me, a lot of other people out there are saying the same thing about the bombers off the tee. He doesn't fit that narrative. So he could be a little bit overlooked there in that mid 7K range. So, if you're looking for a little bit of differentiation and that's your goal out there with that play, then I think it makes a lot of sense. You Googled Pot Guider the other day. You two could be brothers from a different mother. Yeah, I'll admit that, especially with the longer hair going. I see what you're saying. And I don't disagree with you at all, Jason. You come from poker. So GTO sings to you of Coca. Any info on the Safa stats? Yeah, I mean, I have some loaded in here, but it's not much. So just to show you, he's losing about 2 strokes on approach and then losing at the short game. Yeah, the stats I have aren't great. Let's put it that way. But again, it's like 4 rounds or 2 rounds, whatever we have on him. Can I deep dive Castillo? So yeah, really good ball striking stats out there for Castillo. So his best performance was at the Farmers, which is another one of those really off the tee heavy golf courses. So if you're going to have your best performance anywhere, I like that it was out there at the Farmers. Flush draw off the tee also gains with the approach play. If you're looking for a ball striker, he fits that. But the short game has left a lot to be desired out there for Ricky. So if you're looking for a pop performance, it's really clear what has to happen. He's got to go out there, turn that short game where he's losing about a stroke per round, and he's got to gain about a stroke per round, which isn't going to happen that often for a player that's struggling with that short game. But when they do, I mean, think of Tom Hoagie, think a Lucas Glover, for example, right? When he gains out there with the short game any given week, he goes out there and contends. So he's a high upside, I would say wide range of outcomes player there with Castillo. But there's at least an avenue for him to get there. I like that you enjoy what I said, and hey, I got to keep it real, right? And it's true. That's how they play. They play like they have a tampon in. Same strategy here in single entry. Yeah, it's a mental thing for me, right? It's not even like modeling wise. I mean, you guys know I do my modeling, do my course breakdowns. That's a big part of the edge that I play as well. The psychological edge in single entry is even bigger than that, in my opinion. And that's why I play in those $200+ contests, because the higher entry fee that you play in, the more that happens. Luke always keeps it real, you know it. Hey, Luke, looking forward to the breakdowns. Good luck this week. Of course, Nika, best of luck yourself. What do I think the ownership on Lipsky will be? So I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, Ollie. In fact, let me just bring it up on another tab so I can give you a for sure answer. But I know it's sub 5%. He's not getting that much attention. So if you're worried about the ownership, I'd say don't worry about it all that much. But yeah, just to confirm, I've got him sub 2%. I can give you it narrowed down just even a little bit more than that. So yeah, if you're worried about the ownership there, don't be. Am I interested in Knapp at all? Obviously, returning champ and still in good form. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. He's, got some ownership behind him, but he won here last year and he started to look a lot better over the last month or so. I have some interest, Jordan. I don't want to say more than that, but yes, there's definitely some interest there. Anthony says, hey, Luke, any love for Jesper Svensson? Yeah, there's some love there. He's long off the tee. He's also a really good ball striker. That's where he carries his game for the most part. So I'm there myself. You've got a strong feeling that Smalley is going to be way higher owned than 13%. Yeah, I could see it definitely in single entries. I could see him being like 15 to 20%. 150 maxes, we'll have to see, Goombas. I'm predicting 13%. That's what those projections are for. Griffin says, last name for you, You're so crazy to see Carson Young in that spot. He's got to be low owned. Yeah, I don't know if I'd say he's low owned, Griffin, because I've got him about average ownership for that range. But yeah, decent course fit, good long iron play, that's for sure. And Campos picked up the win in the fall swing. Is he in play for you? I would say, yeah, he's in play. He really ball striked it well here last year. If you guys remember, he had that top 20 finish. He maybe had a hole-in-one. Maybe I'm misremembering that. During like the final round, he may have holed out for hole-in-one or something like that. But yeah, he's in play. He's a good ball striker. But just like, I forget who we had the question about before. I think it was Castillo we were going over. You just got to turn the putter, dude. I mean, if he gains a stroke or two putting this week, it could be big. You need a one-time pick for me for a one and done. You're doing terribly. If you're going to go through any one and done stuff, Allie, you can go through one of my core plays. But I'm not going to pick your one and done for you. I don't do that. What's going on, Joseph? Welcome on into the stream. And let's go through some of these value plays towards the bottom. So any other deep dives, I will still do for you guys. But I do want to go through some of these diamonds in the rough that I had for you. And the reason for that, we've got 5 more minutes for DFS talk before we got to get through prop stuff. So you got to get through this a little bit quickly here. So first diamond in the rough is going to be Chris Goddard here at 5% ownership. So I wouldn't call him like a true diamond in the rough because I'm looking for like 2 1%ers when it comes to calling them that sort of play. But he's lower owned than some of the chalk around him. And, you know, I like a pot guider. I already mentioned, you know, he's one of my core plays. Bet him there 82.5 to 1. But he's nearly 10% owned. So if you're looking to find some guys that are a little bit lower owned, you know, at Castillo, he's also not getting all that much attention. Like he could be one of those players that you're using for some leverage, but a Goddard, a winner from just this last year, one of the longest players that we have in the field, and a player that on Paspalum grass has been one of the best putters that we have in this range. It just screams upside to me. And he's got all the power that you need for this sort of track. He's low owned, 5%. You know, like I said, it's some attention there, but like even guys like a Toasty, I've got a higher ownership than a Goddard. And, you know, it's not like the form is great on either of those two players. Give me the guy that's actually won on the PGA Tour before. So that's an example of one of the low-owned plays that I have in my player pool down low. Of course, we're going to get through 2 more here, but for all of those, you can check them out over there on my Patreon page. But Thurston Lawrence would be another example of a lower-owned, a little bit of an overlooked player. I also bet him for a top 20 here at plus 375, and he's only 2.9% owned. And what you like about Thurston Lawrence, he's one of the longest players that we have in this field, a very aggressive player, which I like for his Draftkings scoring. He's one of the highest birdie or better percentage players he had in all the DP World Tour. So even if he just makes the cut, let's say finishes like top 25 or something like that, he's going to outscore his placement position because of how aggressive he is. He hits driver on pretty much every single hole, which, by the way, at a driver-heavy golf course where length is important, right? That's the kind of player that we want, right? We don't want somebody that's positional, right? More of a, you know, tactician off the tee. We want guys that are like Happy Gilmore, just going bombs away off the tee. And that's what you have with Thurston here at $7,000. He doesn't give a shit. I mean, like you've seen on the DP World Tour. I mean, if you're a follower of the DP World Tour, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It'll be a hole that is 15, 20 yard wide fairway, water to the left, out of bounds to the right. Thurston Lawrence doesn't give a fuck. You know what he does? He grabs his driver and he bangs it out there literally every single time. And you know why he gets away with it? Because he's pretty accurate off the tee as well. He's one of the best drivers that you have in this kind of field. I like the guy because of that big nuts kind of personality that he has. Like I said, just no fucks given, goes out there and will take driver every single time. That's the kind of player that you want at this kind of golf course. So, you know, there are plenty of players that you could kind of compare a Thurston Lawrence to, but at 3% ownership, he's a way that you could get different compared to some of the other players here. And like a Vince Norman, very talented guy, one on the DP World Tour as well, also a bomber off the tee, but he's more than double the ownership that we have here with the Thurston Lawrence. So, you know, when you're comparing them apples to apples, I know Thurston didn't win on the DP World Tour last year, but he had 3 top 5 finishes compared to just the 1 over there for Vince Norman. So, you know, that's why I'm trying to go with some of these lower owned players. It's not just up top with guys like a Bo Hostler, but it's also, and I would say especially even more so, down here towards the bottom end of the board. And then the last guy and we're going to go through here is going to be Jose Luis Ballester. This is the USAM champion that we mentioned on the Showdown streams from a few weeks ago. He's getting his second PGA Tour start this year, and he's third in the collegiate standings. So he's had a very good year this year in terms of his collegiate results. And I got him for a top 20 at plus 800, which he did an interview with the media today. He went through some questions, and he said that this golf course is like perfect setup for him, right? It's a bomber's course. He's a bomber off the tee. He's a really good long iron player. He mentioned having that. And he said all he needs to do is go out there and actually make some putts, and he could see himself up there towards the top end of the board. you're giving me plus 800 on him finding a way to make some putts, right? If that's the way that he can go out there and get towards the top, I'll take plus 800 on that all day, right? Especially when he's a U.S. amateur champion. Like, you don't do that if you're some slapdick out there. You don't get lucky and go out there and win the U.S. amateur. It's all that match play back to back to back. You can't get lucky on match play in like 7-8 matches back to back to back. And then going out there and beating guys that are towards the top of their craft, like Nick Dunlap won the U.S. amateur, Sahith Theegala, right? Guys like Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods all got that job done. These are high pedigree guys that go out there and get that done. And the third in the collegiate series just further confirms that this kid's an absolute stud. So, there are guys down here that are getting some ownership. Give me the sub 1% ballasters over the guys that are actually getting attention, because just like the guys in the 9, 10K range are absolute slapdicks, I mean, the 6K range in this sort of field is full of even more slapdicks out there in this kind of field. So just kind of know who you're dealing with, right? When you're choosing between all the shit down low, try and find some bright spots, some diamonds in the rough, like we've just gone through here. So guys like Thurston Lawrence, I mean, you go through his pedigree, he's way, way better than every other guy around him. You go down to Ballaster here, he's going to be way, way, way better than all these other guys around him. Don't just be taking all these complete shitballs down towards the bottom end of the board. Like, there are some guys down here that I've heard talked up on podcasts that are probably going to be like 2 to 5% owned that absolutely suck. Like, that you've never even seen before. Like this Carl Phillips guy, I've heard good things about him on the college circuit, but he's going to be like high owned this week because he's wearing Sunday Reg and he's the Tiger sponsorship out there on tour. Like, come on, like, what are we doing out here? And, I hate to pick on anyone in particular. I probably shouldn't have pointed out Carl, because I'll probably go out there in top 10 now that I started talking shit. But like, there are countless examples of that. So like down here in the 6K range, just don't fall trap into those just absolute pieces of donkey chalk. You'd be an idiot to go out there and play anyone with ownership down low. It's normally the case like that in major championships, that the chalk in the 6K range in majors can be really egregious. When it's the Mexico Open, when we have like pretty much a Corn Ferry Tour field out here, it's even more so the case. Just so please, PSA out there to everyone, please keep that in mind when you're building your lineups. Let's go over here to Draftkings. We're going to build a few lineups together now, and we'll go over any last second questions that you guys have. Let me leave off. Any guys from Mexico that I like? Not really. I said Alvaro Ortiz before Sol, but I'm not taking that narrative. Feels like a young up-and-comer is going to win this one. Could I do a deep dive on Thor Bjornsson? So yeah, Paul, I'll go back to my sheet real quick, but Thor Bjornsson is somebody I've actually bet outright this week. So you're not going to get any pushback from me out there on playing him. He's 8% owned. I got him there at 66-1. He's played really poorly his past few events. So you go over here to the recent form, you'll see why he's maybe a little bit lower owned. He went T74, cut and cut. So that's a tough scene. That's pretty tough to get over. But if you take a look at his long-term stats, flusher off the tee, good long iron player, and can gain strokes putting. He's a very streaky with his shots gained putting, but on his better weeks is capable of gaining 3-4 shots to the field. So I like him in the GPP format. That's why I bet him outright too. Streaky players are good for taking for top 5 and for wins. And that's kind of what you're getting with Thor. So embrace the variance, embrace the chaos if you're playing a guy like him. Zach says, is this a course with the afternoon winds pretty much come up regardless of the forecast? At least that's how I interpret what you said there. Or is that Diamante? It happens here as well. So I forget who to give credit for this. I saw it on Twitter earlier this week. Yeah, I'm not even going to guess because I don't want to attribute the wrong person. But somebody tweeted out the splits between morning and afternoon, and it was about 0.55 shots. So it happens here. It happens at a lot of other courses as well. But yeah, you were thinking about here with that kind of comment. What's the DP World Tour, Nick? That is the craziest comment I've ever seen from you down there in chat. If you guys don't know, Nick is like the DP World Tour savant. So he's being very sarcastic there. Any thoughts on Jesper Svensson? Kind of like him this week. I like his skill set fit, but he's getting some steam. So in DFS, if you're really trying to get different, you're not really going to accomplish that with Jesper, but he's still in play for sure. I'm playing him in my 150 max for some transparency. Thurston Lawrence finished 4th in the Open Championship. Yeah, exactly, right? He has, 3 top 5s last year, 2 on the regular DP World Tour. And then, yeah, he looked like he could even win. Dude, I'm a huge fan of his game. If I had to put like my favorites that came over in the DP World Tour, Thurston's number 1. He's one of my favorite players, period, in the world. Number 2 is Rasmus Højgaard. And I've been waiting for those two bastards to make it to the PGA Tour for 4 years at this point. And they've been close to getting that, ability to come over for 4 years at this point. So people are going to learn at some point. It might not be this week, but when he goes out there and he has his best stuff, it's a top 10 finish. I mean, that's how he is on the DP World Tour, right? He misses cuts or he finishes top 10, which is pretty much exactly what we want for DFS. 2 Thors and 2 Højgaards in one lineup too much. I'm going to have that. So it's Thorbjorn Olesen, by the way, would be the other Thor on top of good old Michael Thorbjornsson. And then the 2 Hoes. Yeah, I'll probably have lineups with all 4. Thanks for the great stream as always. Of course, Luke Potgeider. Jacob Bridgman thoughts, T15 at the Worldwide Technologies and Bermuda. Yeah, so he's a high birdie percentage player. So if Jacob Bridgman can make the cut, I like his chances to score well on DraftKings. If you take a look at last year, he was a top 50 birdie maker on the PGA Tour and a relatively high eagle rate as well. So an aggressive player. If you're looking for that kind of option, then he fits that. What do you think about Rasmus, Rogers, and Jaeger for all the unders on strokes? So we'll talk through some prop stuff here in just a minute or so. So just hold tight after we go through a lineup together. So let me bring up DraftKings. We're going to go through that lineup construction. By the way, guys, if you haven't already smashed that like button, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and do so. And also subscribe to the channel so you guys don't miss any of the content to come. Let's go through this lineup construction. So in terms of our lineup construction here, this will be for the large field GPP. So, we could go through cash, which would really just be clicking all the highest projected plays. If you want the highest projected plays, you're going to have to check out my Patreon page for that. But where it gets far more interesting and where I can offer you guys some value out there in your process is the 150 max perspective. Because in 150 maxes, we really have to be worried about having that leverage to the field. Now, this is the secondary $20, so it's maybe not as big a deal, right? There's only about 9,000 entries here. I mean, beating 9,000 other people still isn't easy to do, right? So you're still going to have the leverage to move up in your lineups. But if you're talking about like the big $5, big $25 this week, where it's like 50,000 entries that you're playing against, then making sure that you have an ability to move up those leaderboards is absolutely key. And what I mean by that is, if you have a 30% owned guy and he goes off. So let's say Akshay, you guys know I have him over 30% projected owned. He goes off, you're in a 50,000 entry contest. That's like 15,000 other entries that you're playing against right there. Could even be more than that if the ownership's inflated. If you play somebody that, let's say, is 1% owned, out there in that 50,000 entry contest, then you're playing against a much smaller subset out there in that kind of pool. So that's the idea when you're talking about leverage. And you can have one guy like an Akshay out there in a lineup, right? Using one 30% owned player wouldn't be the end of the world. But when you make a habit of it over a set of 6 players is where it starts to become more of an issue. So for the sake of this, we're going to start with a pretty chalky start of 2 players. And, Akshay, he could maybe be that one chalky guy that you're using towards the top. And then down here in this 8K range, I'm also going to throw in a Jake Knapp here at $8,600. And I'm also going to throw in a Højgaard here at $8,100, which this would probably be a little bit more popular than I want to start most lineups with. But the idea here, this is just an exercise, right? This isn't necessarily a lineup that I would ever fall on over there in the GPPs, but it's an exercise to show you what I'm thinking about when it comes to the ownership. Because if I'm starting with 30%, 15, and then maybe even close to 15% ownership down there with a Nikolai Højgaard, well, then your last 3 spots are going to have to be where almost all of your leverage is coming in. Where when you have somebody get to an optimal or near optimal performance, where you're actually moving yourself up those leaderboards. Because with this set of 3 players, in those large field GPPs, you're sharing that set of 3 with probably at least 500 to 1,000 other people, which means you still have to beat 1,000 other entries, maybe 500 other entries with 3 spots, which is not easy to do. So that's why we really focus on that ownership. So for your next man in this kind of lineup, maybe rather than going to a more popular player in this range, let's see, I guess there's not a great example. Like this top end of the 7K range doesn't have anyone I'd really classify as chalk, but like a Fishburne is maybe being a little bit overlooked. Down here towards the middle end of the 7s, like maybe a stay away from an Eric Van Rooyen or a Chan Kim as they're getting a little bit more popular. Like even a Jesper Svensson, right? He's getting a little bit more ownership. And that's where you mix in a Jacob Bridgman, who I know we had the question about before, but he's not going to be nearly as popular as some of the other guys around him. Because we started with some chalkier players towards the top, that's why we had to be a little bit more careful a little bit further down towards the bottom. Now, let's say we still start with Akshay, but our second and third man in are maybe a little bit lower owned. So, for example, Hostler, I already mentioned that he's probably going to be a little bit overlooked. Let's go with Ryan Fox as opposed to a Nikolai Højgaard. Fox will probably be closer to that 10 to 12% range when it comes to that ownership. That would be at the very most. Have him actually a little bit below 10% when it comes to that ownership. If we start a little bit lower owned, a little bit more differentiated up there with our 8K plus options, well, down here in that 7K range, you can afford to take players that are a little bit higher owned. So Thor Bjornsson, who's getting a little bit more steam than some of the other lower owned guys around him, you could afford to take in this kind of lineup because we've already started to offset that ownership a little bit. Rather than having to go to a Bridgman here, maybe you go to an Erik van Rooyen, who has that elite tier course history. And then your last spin in, of course, Draftkings doesn't let you go through all 6 different players. But even if you wanted to take somebody that had some ownership down here, now at 7K, there's not really anyone that's chalk. Maybe a Norman, I'd say. There's a little bit over 5, maybe 7% ownership right there. Even if you took a Norman at $7,000 to round that off, you're fine because you don't have chalk at all 6 spots. You don't even have chalk at more than really 1-2 spots out there in this kind of lineup. So large field GPPs, that's where you really want to force in that differentiation. If you're doing it by hand, you want to be thinking about the things that we just went through. But if you're building on an optimizer, there are ways to enforce that kind of ownership role as well, whether it's a cumulative ownership cap. If that's what your optimizer runs off of, you can always go out there and do that. That just adds up all the ownership together. You can set that to a number and then optimize based on that. By the way, the bigger the GPP, the lower that number should be. And then same thing for product ownership. That's what I personally prefer because product ownership gives you a better sense of actually how chalky a lineup is. But you set your product ownership cap, you go out there and run lineups, and you by default make sure that you're getting the differentiation that you need. So that's what I would recommend over there with your optimizers. Again, all of them are kind of different. And the one that I've coded that I've been using for years myself, it runs with a product ownership cap. So I changed that based on the contest that I'm entering. And I've been very transparent about how I set my product ownership cap. It's 1 over the total amount of entries. I want to have a theoretical dupe percentage under 1 out there per lineup, which means that when you take my product ownership and then you multiply it by the amount of entries in the contest, it has to be less than 1, because if it's over 1, that means in theory that more than one lineup should have that exact same combination of 6 players. Now, it's not an exact science because when you take salary into consideration, it really mucks all of that up, but it's just a good way for me to make sure that I'm not going to have a lineup with too much ownership. So however you're doing that, it can be cumulative ownership, product ownership, or building by hand. That leverage is something that you want to be going out there and mixing in. But that's all I've got for the DFS side. So as I mentioned before, we're going to go over to the prop side of things now. So let me go ahead and bring up Prize Picks so we can go through that board. I already had Underdog up, but Prize Picks, for whatever reason, if I'm idle on it for too long, it locks me out. So let me bring that up, reshare my screen, and I'll go over any last second DFS stuff that you guys have down there in chat. But we're going to be focusing on the prop side and Underdog and Prize Picks. And if you were just here for DFS, I still appreciate all you guys stopping by as per usual. Just smash a like button if you guys haven't already before you hop on out of here. Where'd we leave off, though? Yes, Paul, that's the DP World Tour lineup of the week. You could throw in a Nicholas Norgard Moller, who's also from Denmark. And you could have like the whole Denmark lineup too. So I guess you'd have to take Thor Bjornsson out of there. He's American, so he doesn't qualify there. But if you went with those two, Moller, there's got to be at least one more guy from Denmark over there in the player pool. Then that's 4 guys from one country there. And you might even be able to get all 6 if you really work for it. Manicero thoughts? I've got to say that he's a high pedigree player. He's been around for quite some time, Sam. He's not a bomber off the tee. So, for some people, that might be a deal breaker when it comes to the skill set, but he does have good mid to long irons. So if there's any sort of player that can overcome not having those irons, it's a Manicero that hits his, shots from 175 plus rather well. Nap under 68.5. Yeah, we'll go over the prop stuff that you were throwing in the chat before after we go through some conditions. So I'll circle right back to you, JR. I won't forget about you. Gsluke, where'd I buy the blends? I actually got it from my mom for Christmas. So that was just a normal bottle of blends. I have an aged one that I haven't quite cracked open yet, Joseph. I'm waiting for a full prop sweep before we do that. So if we can full prop sweep on every single slip that I enter over there on the Patreon, we're going to crack open the 15-year aged blends. But yeah, I got it through my mom, so I'd have to ask her, honestly. It was a Christmas gift that I ended up getting. So let's go through some stuff over here on the prop side of things. So they've got the averages up from last year, which I think it's going to be a little bit firmer and faster this year. And I'll share the quote with you guys. Why not? So I got to bring up the PGA Tour media site. So just bear with me while I do that here, guys, which I can't log into that on stream. I can't show you guys my credentials. But what I'm going to show you guys are these interviews, and in specific, an interview that they had with Rafa Campos. And I posted this over there in my Discord page, but there's a quote from him that I think really gives us a good taste for how it's going to play. So if we go over here, it's the first question that he got. And the question was cut off, so we can't even really see what he was asked about. But this is what I really want to focus on right here. So I'm gonna highlight it here for you guys to read. He said, yeah, obviously this place is beautiful right now. Conditions are phenomenal. I won't lie. We know you're not lying, Campos. I don't know why you said that there. But he said, tee boxes, fairways, greens are all in pristine shape. The course, I can tell it hasn't rained in a long time. And that's the one I really want to focus on right there, right? He says, I can tell the course has not rained in a long time. That means it's firm and fast, right? That's him essentially telling us that without him actually saying that. They keep it in great shape is what he goes on to say. And then he goes on to say that he played well here last year, blah, 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 blah. And he said, the course is playing along. It really is. It's not as windy as last year, but like I said, the course is in great shape, and it's a great test for us golfers. And then he goes on to mention again, it's a great test. What he's kind of hinting at here, and I've looked at some of the other interviews as well. The guys like Jose Luis Barrio, right? He's only been here this time, right? So he wouldn't really know what to say. But Campos is comparing this to last year, and he says that you can tell there hasn't been a lot of rain there. I think the green regulation average is going to go down a little bit. I think that if it was going to be windy, right? He mentioned the lack of wind. It's not as windy as last year. If it was windy, it would probably play harder, what we had for last year. But because the wind is going to be lower, I think these averages are actually going to be pretty accurate. But I think it's with a different set of conditions, right? It might still play to that -1 average, but it's not because the course is going to be playing the same way. I think that your fairway average is going to go down. I think your green average is going to go down if the course is playing firmer and faster, but it also means that the ball is going to go farther off the tee. It also means without all that wind out there that you're not going to have that element to go out there and battle. So, I could see the scoring staying about the same, but it's going to have a little bit of a different identity out there this year. Like the bogey average might go up a little bit with those firm and fast greens, but the birdie average, because you're hitting the ball further off the tee, you don't have all those winds to go after. That's probably going to go up as well. So I just think that it's going to change a little bit the identity out here. Rounds 2 through 4, right after we have the data from round 1, we're really going to get a good sense for how this golf course is playing in 2025. But my current assumption are that these averages are pretty accurate and that they're just going to change ever so slightly out there with these changing conditions. And the reason why I bring up that quote about Campos is I ended up taking an under out there on greens regulation before I saw this quote. So I didn't even know that he said it was going to play firm and fast. So there's already some value out there for unders on greens. And then he tells us that he can tell that the course hasn't gotten rain in a while. And that was really where I was sold out there on that sort of prop. So we'll go through the boards now. I'll give you guys a few of those leans that I mixed in. But yeah, we'll go through the green regulation prop first. So it's an under over here on Aaron Rye greens. The average, just to go back to that, 11.88 out there in 2024. And if it's firmer and faster, it's reasonable to say that that's not going to get that much better, right? I would say at best it's probably going to play to like a 12 average tomorrow. That would be assuming that the firm greens aren't that big of a factor, but he's a PM wave player, so he goes off in the afternoon when conditions are going to get a little bit windier than the morning. So just to circle back to that, winds go from like 4 or 5 miles an hour closer to like 8 or 9, and the wind gusts, they go from non-existent in the morning closer to like 15 to 17 miles an hour in the afternoon, which this isn't difficult conditions, right? That's not what I'm pointing out there at the weather, but I am pointing out that they're not playing in a dome, and they're certainly not going to be playing in a dome over there in the afternoon. And when you take a look at his track record around this golf course, he's made the cut in 2 of his 3 starts. So he has 10 rounds around here. He's only gone over this line in 4 of his 10 rounds. And 3 of those came last year. So last year he went 3-1 out there on that sort of prop. Before that, he was 1 for 6 when it came for going over this 13.5 line. And I think what especially made me like the fact that we took this under is when we got back to this quote. And Rafa Campos, just for transparency, right? Last year was the first time that he played at this golf course. He said, I can tell that there hasn't been a lot of rain here. So that tells me right off the bat that the greens aren't as receptive as last year, right? And if that only year where Aaron Rye had any sort of success at going over this line was when the greens were more receptive, That's why I really like this under, because the other 2 years where he struggled a little bit more, right, he went under this in 5 of his 6 rounds. So that's the idea over there with Aaron Rye. And I personally mixed it in over here with this Ryan Fox under on strokes, which I still like. He is an AM wave tee time, but I honestly like this one over here on Nikolai a little bit more. So this was at 68.5 when I ended up writing my article for Bet the Number earlier, but it went from 68.5 up there to 69. And he's somebody I bet for an outright. He does have the PM tee time, so he's going off at 1:32 p.m. By the way, these ones over here on the right are almost always going to be wrong, so make sure you check the ones over here on the board to get their actual tee time for tomorrow. He is a PM wave where, it might get a little bit windier in the afternoon, but I don't think it's going to play drastically harder on that side of things. And with that push equity there at -2, that's the kind of player I'd be taking for the under. But if you guys want to tail what I did over there on the Bet the Number blog, that would be these 2 props out there in combination. But if you wanted to throw in this Højgaard under, that is something that I'm probably going to get some exposure to myself. In fact, I haven't mixed in this prop into a slip quite yet myself. But when I find some sort of combination to go out there and mix in with it, it's something I'm going to go out there and mix in. So by the way, on the Bet the Number blog, that is a free post that I go over there and post every single week over there, going over a complete stat breakdown, which I show it all the time here on these streams, but I'm going to do it again for anyone here that's a little bit new, going over a complete breakdown of the golf course. And not only that, a free play every single week. And last week, these ended up bumping rather quickly. So that's why I like to get you guys onto the newsletter over here, get an update as soon as it goes live. But yeah, that's where you can find this. So I'm going to go ahead, throw a link down in the live chat for you guys to go out there and sign up for the newsletter, but it's completely free, right? This is a prop that I put out every single week. It's 2 props out there for 2-leg slip, and it's completely transparent, right? I do a breakdown, I do a recap every single week of how it goes, no matter what happens, whether we go 2-0 and win like we did last week or we lose. And I will say our hit rate on these has been 10-4 for this year, so over a 70% hit rate on props. And the profit loss has actually been a little bit more modest than what I would like, but still making profit on the year. If you're $100 better, you're up nearly $200 on the year so far. So make sure to sign up for that if you guys haven't already. A lot of extra nuggets on here as well when it comes to the modeling, the forecast that we just went through, all of that stuff as well. In terms of the underdog board, let me go ahead and refresh this so we can go over this side of things. There wasn't as much that I entered over there in underdog, and I can tell you that the 2 props that I took over here have both already bumped. But what I do know is that Nikolai is also over there at 69 strokes, and I believe they also, let me see if Ryan Fox is over there at 69 strokes. Like they have almost the same board as what they have over there in Prize Picks. So everything that we just said over there on the Prize Picks side can be rinsed and repeated over here on underdog. Now, I don't think they have the greens regulation posted. So I guess just to confirm that, let's check out Aaron Ryan, see if they have that up. So yeah, nothing posted when it comes to that, but they do have these front and back 9 props posted, which could be an edge of its own. So I guess we'll go through those while we're at it over here. They must have just posted those over the last hour or something. So I'm curious which side plays easier, which we're going to need data golf to go through some of that data and whether there's an edge to be had. Because, I mean, when you add up those 2 for Aaron Rye, it adds up to 68 as opposed to the 68 projection that he had. So I'm curious if one of these 2 props was a severely mispriced. It could be, but we'll have to see. All righty, let's catch up on chat now. So we had some questions about some props, and I want to get back to those for JRK. So thoughts on some guys for under 68.5 strokes. What I'll say, JRK, is I usually try to stay away from props that you can get for a better line elsewhere. And that would be a case with a lot of those guys that you mentioned. So just to go through them on here, Steven Yeager, you can get for -110 over here on books. So that one's maybe not the best example of it. So P-Rod was one. Who was the other one? It was Rasmus Højgaard was another one of the players that you wanted to point out there. The one I'd be the most okay with would be Rasmus because he is -125 for the under, but none of those would be plus EV values. Now, I was worried that some of them were going to be like -150 for the over, like you can see there with the bow. Who else is like -140 over? Like a Ben Griffin, for example, right? He's -140 for the over, but you did choose guys that were a little bit closer to even money odds. that's the worry I have is like the sports books, they're projecting a lot of those guys at 68.5 for the over. Like even Jaeger here, right? He is minus 130 out there towards the over. Like a Patrick Rogers, he is minus 125 out there towards the over, but it's not a terrible bet to go out there and take the under. I'd just say, I don't know if there's a lot of value there because of the sportsbook odds that we're seeing. Nap for the under 68.5, I'd probably stay away from that one just because the sportsbook odds, not the greatest. I don't think we have an actual line for comparison, but using some of these other players around him for comparison, you'd have to think that he'd be juiced over because he's a lower tier player, a little bit more inconsistent than an Aaron Rye. And even an Aaron Rye is minus 135 under. He's a little bit of a lower tier player than a Steven Jaeger, right? He's a little bit lower on the betting board, Draftkings pricing, all of that kind of stuff, matchup markets, all of that, favor somebody like a Jaeger over a Jake Knapp. And Jaeger's minus 130 for the over. So that would be the concern I would have with some of those 68.5s is that their only player, by the way, that's like a plus EV under out there at 68.5 is Akshay Bhatia. And then over here on sites like Prize Picks, he's already down at 68 strokes. So they've already taken that away from us in terms of that value. That's the worry with the 68.5 board. Now, will some go under? For sure. Scoring average is going to be like 1.5 under par is what I'm expecting out there for tomorrow. But you've got to gain 1.5 strokes to a 1.5 under par scoring average to shoot -3 and go under that sort of line, which is not something that these sort of players always do. Like a P-Rod, a Jaeger, one of the other, I forget who the other one was that you pointed out, but all three of those players, they're a little bit better than the PGA Tour average typically, like maybe a half a stroke gained per round. This is a weaker field event, so you have to account for that a bit. But you're asking guys that are just like, above average players to gain 1.5 strokes to the field. That's the hesitation I have. That's the reason I point that out. Where did we leave off? Michael Kim or Kurt Kitayama for tier 2. You can't pull the trigger. Ooh, I'd probably go Kurt Kitayama if you had those two to choose from. The course history of Kitayama, that's a little bit hard to overlook. And, the form on Michael Kim is really solid, but that's also going to make him a little bit higher owned. So I'd go with Kurt Kitayama out of those two. Of course, Maddie C said, Luke, appreciate your hard work and dedication. I appreciate your nice comment there, dude. So thank you for stopping by. All the DraftKings FanDuel lines are 68.5, which feels too low. Yeah, I'm with you, Mark. I think that they should probably be a little bit higher, but if they were at 69.5, they would also probably have to be juiced like minus 140, minus 150 for the under. So I think that 69 strokes there right in the middle, I think that's the sweet spot because, a player like Rogers, Jaeger, all those sort of guys, they're slightly above average players. And in this kind of field, they probably will gain about a stroke per round to the field. Like that feels very reasonable for those kind of players, but asking them to gain over a stroke to the field, like you said, it feels like a little bit of a tough ask when you're not dealing with Scotty Scheffler, Rory McIlroy. You're not dealing with Justin Thomas, Sungjae Im up there towards the top end of the board. I've done this so long, and I can tell, Mark, you've probably done this quite a while yourself as well. Like these sort of players, there's a reason why they're slapdicks. There's a reason why they're playing on a week like this, and it makes me a little hesitant. That's for sure. Thank you for the content, Big Dog. Looking forward to round 2 showdown. Of course, yeah, that'll be over there on the Ship It Nation YouTube channel, by the way. So make sure to stop on by for all of that. That's all I've got out here for the live stream for this week, guys. Best of luck with all the exposure that you guys are going with. Go ahead, smash that like button if you guys haven't already, and make sure to stop on by for all the content throughout the weekend. Showdown streams on the Ship It channel, as I just mentioned, and then the prop and betting streams will be afterwards on my YouTube channel. And because we're in the central time zone this week over there in the mountain time zone in Mexico, we're not going to have super late live streams. Like we're going to be doing the showdown stream right around 7 p.m. Eastern. That's at least as of right now, the tentative start time. And then the prop and betting streams, rather than them having to be at like 10:30 p.m., which trust me, it's annoying for me as annoying as it is for you guys. Trust me, it's annoying having to wait for content. I get that. Even more annoying to have to do the content when I'm trying to go to sleep like an hour later. So it's great to have it set up this way this time around. So your boy will be a little bit more awake out there for those live streams and ready to get after it out there for the weekend. So I've already got my lamp spilt. I'm going to go ahead, play some video games myself, but I'll see you guys out there throughout the rest of the weekend.